So it's a couple of minutes past the hour, so we are going to get started now. And so welcome everybody to the Tariffs Impact webinar. The structure of today is we tried to find three excellent speakers to talk about three pressing issues. I think we did very well on lining up three excellent speakers who will get introduced and present. But we have an economic update, we have a legal update, and we have what we're calling a grants update. And the idea is we've never had more uncertainty than we do today. And the biggest issue is it's literally changing every day. And so we gave these three very good speakers a very tough task, which is come to us and give us the most up-to-date information you have. And I'm guessing each speaker probably has updated their presentation 10 times in the last 10 days. But before we get into that, I'm going to do a couple housekeeping items, and then we're going to have opening remarks from the president of RESCON, Richard Lyle. So to start it off, yes, you can get a copy of the recording, and yes, you can get a copy of the presentations. As always, we will send it out after the webinar is complete. And the only other thing I'll do is a quick land acknowledgement. And so we just like to respectfully acknowledge that we're situated on traditional territories and treaty lands, in particular those of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, as well as the Anishinaabe of the Williams Treaty First Nations and the Huron-Wendat and Métis Nations. As ResCon's office is located in Vaughan, we are grateful to the opportunity to work and live in this area. And with that, we'll invite Richard to give some opening remarks.
Hey, thanks for that, Andrew, and thanks for everybody for getting this session put on. It's certainly timely. Needless to say, we are in unprecedented times. ResCon is part of the Canada-U.S. Trade Council, so it's multi-sectoral, and we have weekly briefings, and we've been following this and also advocated for being very careful on any measures related to housing because we already have a housing crisis, taxes, red tape, everything else like that. So this obviously is happening at the worst possible time. And of course, things are evolving every day. It's not even really clear what the US objective is here at the end of the day. But certainly at this time, right now, things are completely up in the air. Housing is huge for Canada, and it's for many obvious reasons, but hundreds of thousands of employees, billions of dollars in work, and there's a very long list of products and materials that are going to be and have been already affected by this tariff war. Upwards of 50% of building materials are directly infected by anything that happens here. And of course, we need to keep building housing. And to be competitive, we've got to get a lot better at it than we have been. You cannot build an economy and you can't build prosperity unless you have good, affordable housing. And of course, we've been suffering there. Now, interestingly enough, the Americans in their own way are in the same boat. Small business confidence in the U.S. is dropping like a rock right now. We know what's happening with the markets. Premier Ford's taken a very hard stand on this issue, and hopefully that'll bring things to a head sooner rather than later. Of course, the big unknown is, the guy in the White House is completely unpredictable, and he is a, full-blown narcissist. So he has to be right. So how we get to that point remains to be seen because things are completely up in the air, but hopefully this will come to a head soon. We will continue to follow this. We will be informing our members, and we might likely have another session fairly soon. Anyways, I just wanted to say that. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to our speakers.
Perfect. And so our first speaker doesn't really need an introduction. He is a top economist, especially in the world of construction. And so our first speaker is Adam Siswinski, and he's the managing partner of Prison Economics and Analysis. In addition to an expertise in economics, he has an expertise in construction. He's worked with BuildForce, he's worked with the OCS, he's worked with us. There's very few sectors or spots of construction that he doesn't understand or that he hasn't worked with. And obviously this is important because one, we're in collective bargaining, and two, we're a labor relations organization, and so it's nice to have speakers that understand that. And so, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Adam.
All right. Thanks, Andrew. I think the most difficult part is getting the technical stuff out of the way. Everybody see the presentation up on the screen now?
Yeah,
Yep,
we
so
can see
far
it.
so good. Yep.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thanks for that introduction, Andrew, and thanks for the invitation to be here. It are certainly exciting times to be an economist and feel all the attention of questions being asked on what could and might happen in these uncertain times. And it's certainly posed a lot of challenges for us here at Prism in terms of grappling with coming up with answers. We don't necessarily have the body of historical data on what happens on the average trade war from time to time. So there's a lot of dynamics that we're just uncovering on a daily basis as the complexities of the situation continue to evolve. So I want to talk to you today about, again, the context here of the impacts of tariffs on construction and residential construction specifically. And I know there's been a lot of focus on the impacts of tariffs on cost of prices and inflation, both just in the industry, but also in people's lives. And yes, those are all important concerns. And I think one of the most important impacts of this trade uncertainty in Ontario's construction market is really the economic uncertainty that this climate has created. It's certainly this level of uncertainty, I think it's unprecedented, is freezing decision making. And whether that's a major auto sector investment or a small business investment or individual household that's trying to understand, making decisions around their lives. All of these decisions are being deferred and put on hold, which is contributing to some of the already significant economic damage that we're all starting to feel. We're hearing news about projects being deferred, whether major manufacturing sector investments or housing. It's certainly already, without even the tariffs being in place, we're already feeling the impacts of reduced investment, reduced hiring intentions, stock market volatility. All of these things have been studied to be an impact of just the uncertainty alone, let alone what might happen with actual impacts. So I want to speak to both today, just the impacts of this uncertainty on the economic climate with respect to construction, and then we'll certainly want to dig into what we know so far on potential impacts of the tariffs themselves on prices. So let's start with uncertainty. How does this current level of uncertainty compare with the past? Well, what you're looking at here is an index, a policy uncertainty index, that is widely used to measure uncertainty in the economy. It's constructed based on monthly counts of certain terms and phrases in news articles around the world. And if you compare kind of uncertainty measured by this index over time for Canada and US, you certainly see some peaks and valleys. Certainly the Great Recession back in 2008-9 was certainly a key, very stressful, uncertain time. We moved through the early 2000s. We had the Arab Spring, the Egyptian crisis, lots of impacts on oil prices and things. That's everybody remember when the Canadian dollar was actually at 110 against the US. Fond memories of the past, but certainly lots of uncertainty. Then came Trump 1.0, and that period between 2016, right through to 2020, you saw uncertainty certainly rise, and much more so in Canada than US. And by that, then we got to the previous peak. The most uncertain thing that I think many of us have experienced in recent times was the impacts of the global pandemic, and you saw the uncertainty both in Canada, the US, and around the world really go off the charts. That was until Trump 2.0 and the announcement of not the election necessarily, but the announcement to move ahead with tariffs and the chaos that has ensued since. Look, and it's this level of uncertainty that is causing a proportionate impact of damage on this lack of decision making, lack of investments, and causing some of the challenges that we're going to feel likely for the next 4 years. And there are certainly impacts of this on various forecasts that are right now that are not considered. As Andrew mentioned, I work closely with Build, of course, Canada. You know, as fresh as those numbers are, a lot of those assumptions were made back in October and November, which is right now feels like a very long time ago. So I do want to look at what the outlook was like for the economy and the residential sector in specific. And I want to speak to some of those risks specifically in the context of this uncertainty. So if we're looking here at the kind of economic impact or the economic growth outlook for Ontario, well, the light blue bar there, we'll call the baseline outlook, and that was the outlook, going back just a few months ago. The baseline, we'll call it scenario, was to see finally in 2025 some stronger growth return to Ontario's economy. The economy's been quite resilient through the pandemic. We certainly had a bit of a slowdown through 2023 and 2024 when the higher interest rates, were slowing sales and consumer spending as they were meant to bring down those higher rates of inflation. We did see the inflation come down. I think it's quite within the target zone now, and we managed to avoid that technical, recession. And this is the year that we were supposed to reap the benefits of some of those interest rates cuts that made by the Bank of Canada over the last few quarters really start to take effect, and have people and businesses going back out and buying stuff again, and buying big stuff, right? Like homes, cars, all of those things. We were expecting this year to see business investment rise, consumer spending rise, exports rise. All of that is reflected in that growth of, which isn't even that strong, of 1.8% through this year. And next year, we expected that growth to strengthen further, with further residential investment in particular being a strong contributor to that growth. Continued investment in business investment, and a lot of the government and infrastructure investment contributing to stronger growth through 2026, despite a slowing of some population growth. So, not a bad story in terms of what we've been through over the last number of years, and lots of reason for optimism. So that outlook has soured a little bit over the last few months and weeks. And it's been really not an impact of scenario of any tariffs being in place, but just by the prolonged threat of tariffs and a little high level of uncertainty. So, we know that this has this uncertainty alone does have negative economic impact. So, the tariff threat scenario that I put forward for you there, and the dark blue bar, really cuts that strong 1.8% growth projection for this year down to maybe 1% GDP growth. Still positive, but certainly not as high, not as much growth as we saw, we anticipated just a few months ago. And again, a little bit weaker growth to follow next year in 2026. Again, much of this is reflecting kind of delayed, deferred investments, both by consumers and businesses. The final scenario I put forth with you is actually not our own. It's from the Bank of Canada, and they did some impacts on the potential impact of full implementation of 25% tariffs on Canadian goods by the U.S. administration, and a reciprocal response, a full reciprocal response from Canada. They estimate that would shave about to 2.5% to GDP this year, and about 1.5% GDP next year. Before those impacts level off. Well, that culminates in a total net loss to our economy that doesn't, rebound, of about 5% net loss to our economy. So That's what we're looking at, and I think, you know, as it stands now, I think we're probably still closer to kind of, you know, the tariff threat scenario rather than the full tariff scenario. But you know, as folks well know, things are changing quickly and significantly on a daily basis. I just wanted to talk just a little bit about inflation. And the outlook for both the outlook inflation and some of just the risks. I know there's a lot of talk about the risks of, you know, tariffs on inflation after the trauma that we've all just gone through. Well, so far, you know, inflation has been coming down significantly since peaking back in 2022. You know, when money was free and people were spending like sailors. The government of Canada responded very quickly and aggressively to that inflation, hiking overnight rates closer to 5%. And since then we have seen that inflation come down, and it has been coming down rapidly since that peak. And I think, you know, year to date numbers you know, suggest 2024 will end on an annualized basis with inflation around 2.4%. And is likely going to continue downward and stay in and around the Bank of Canada's target, average target range of around 2%. One of the factors that has been keeping inflation up or stubbornly up has been shelter costs. So those are that's a big component of CPI, and we've been seeing those shelter costs finally start to come down as well. Even in, I think some of you are aware, you know, we've actually seen market rent prices actually down on a year-over-year basis in Ontario and in the GTA. So, you know, that's likely going to keep inflation in check through the next number of years, as you can see through the outlook. Now, so what are the potential impacts of tariffs? Well, they can certainly accelerate inflation. With, you know, if there's significant reciprocal tariffs put on U.S. imported goods, food and other things could certainly see an increase in the prices for some of those goods. You know, in the past, the Canadian government has been pretty prudent in its response and been selective in those tariffs to be strategic. That's the same way that we dealt with the tariff impacts back in 2018, and so what we see so far in terms of the retaliatory responses, it tracks a similar vein in that we're looking to hit them where it hurts, and not just a tit for tat, you know, across the board matching of tariffs. So that should certainly, you know, not cushion some of the impacts, and allows, and you know, some of the products that are typically targeted are ones that have some substitution, either domestic or another, you know, imported from another country. And I think likely we're going to see that strategic response continue through this round. But yeah, there's certainly going to be some, you know, potential increase in that inflation near term. But longer term, there's also the break effects of those tariffs. If you saw in the previous slide, the economic impact of essentially a potential recession occurring in this country if the you know, those tariffs are enacted and stay for extended period of time, that's going to build a lot of slack in the economy. We're going to see unemployment go up, not just in manufacturing and the broader economy, and that's going to slow demand for stuff and people wanting to buy stuff. So that's going to bring have a real break effect on inflation, and we're going to see probably those break effects later, you know, in this scenario, but they would come down, you know, it would slow inflation significantly. And at the end of the day, from some of the various, you know, modeling scenarios I've looked at anyway, it does tend to wash out and have a neutral effect over a period of 1 or 2 years. But one thing I'll point out in the case of just ongoing uncertainty and threat of tariffs, it's all breaks, right? There's not the impact of the prices being inflated on the retaliatory tariffs. You're just getting that pullback in investment and spending and confidence. So I think, you know, generally, I think we have managed to tame inflation in Canada successfully, and that's going to, you know, at least bode well for both Canada being able to continue to lower the overnight target rate, and with help of the interest rates and borrowing costs to help cushion some of the blows of the negative impacts of the tariff policies. One other challenge that is not directly related to tariffs, but does have an impact on the construction industry and residential particularly, is the population growth. And specifically, we're expecting a significant slowing in population growth, which has been largely driven by immigration for the last number of years. We saw a large surge in immigration, both permanent and non-permanent immigrants following the pandemic, that increased our population growth in this province above 3%. I mean, those are strong levels of growth in our day and age. And it was certainly responsible for contributing for both our economic growth, as well as some of the demands for housing that we've been feeling, and some of the pressures on inflation and maybe some of the housing availability shortages, but certainly contributing to demand. Well, the federal government's announcement late fall to decrease both the target for permanent admissions by about 100,000 a year from 500,000 around there for the next, and to cap the non-permanent immigrant population at about 5% of our overall population. That equates to basically a net decline in non-permanent residents of about 500,000 per year for the next 2 years. So when you take those, if those policies are enacted, and we do see those declines, Statistics Canada's latest revised population projections for Ontario show Ontario's population growth actually going into negative territory by 2026, which can certainly pose a significant drag on both economic growth through just household consumption and consumer consumption. Also some declines on demand for housing overall. It has also some particular impacts for colleges and post-secondary colleges and universities, because a lot of that decline in the non-permanent immigrant group is going to be focused on international students. We're already seeing a lot of cutbacks in post-secondary institutions program offerings and their investment plans as well. Okay, so what does this mean then for the residential outlook and starts? Well, a lot still remains unclear. What I can show you today is the outlook for housing starts, the latest outlook from Buildforce Canada, just recently released. We have been seeing housing starts on a downward trend since the peak in 2021. Overall starts are down about 24%. A lot of the decline has been focused initially in the single family unit category. We're seeing starts down about 40% in 2024 last year over 2021. Again, this was a post-pandemic, or pandemic up and then post-pandemic down story, where it came down from a peak once those interest rates were aggressively increased from year zero. And so that was purposeful to kind of put the brakes on the economy, and I think it had an effect, desired effect, if you're Bank of Canada, on the economy. But starts, so starts have come down significantly through to 2024. This is the year where that market was expected to turn around as those now lower interest rates start to take into effect. Those were expected to see a pickup in the single detached market in this province with new construction. That yet has not materialized as of yet. But I still think that generally longer term, the outlook still makes sense. We still have we had the high levels of population growth and household formations. There is still a great demand for housing in this province, and single detached housing. So we have had incomes start to catch up, to keep with, as inflation has started to come down. So generally, I think, as the interest rates environment remains low, that we will see some uptick in that single detached market, and it is, I think, likely to continue to rise over the next few years and recover to kind of catch up to the demand driven by household formations. On the apartment side, it's been a little bit of a different story. Apartments, starts only started to decline in after 2023 through 2024. That's and our did come down in 2024 by a significant, about 18%, and we're expected to see that trend continue on the apartments category right well into 2025. And especially declines. I think we're all looking at the urban condo markets as seeing the greatest headwinds. The investors are gone. Rental prices are falling a bit, which makes it even more challenging to carry some of these investment condo units. So it's a real challenge to turn around such a big ship with that momentum. But and some projects have pivoted. There's certainly a lot more now projects being converted to purpose-built rental, but again, completely different model. And it can't turn all of these projects around overnight. So given the current environment with the sales still at record lows, it's unlikely that we're going to see that turn around in the apartments market, especially the high rise this year. But right now the build force outlook anyway does have that turnaround occurring again because of the fundamentals, but not likely until 2026. And then eventually we'll see both markets continue to recover for the next few years in tandem. But under the economic uncertainty that we're dealing with, this I think it's the pace of the recovery that is really in question, and we'll have to wait and see that even in the even a potentially lower interest rate environment, whether we're going to see that demand response come back. If we look at another interesting trend I'd like to watch is the number of units actually under construction, and with falling starts and completions starting to increase in the apartment category, we're starting to I think those apartments under construction, high rise, have reached their peak and likely are going to now start to see declines over the next few years without new starts coming online to replace that stock of units under construction. And we're so this segment with that activity and deployment that comes with it is I think going to continue to see declines right past 2026, even if starts start to come back in that category. On the single family unit market, a little bit of a different story. You can see that those declines in units under construction has already kind of unwound with the starts peaking back in 2022. And if the activity does recover, that ship turns around a little quicker than others, and we're likely to see those units under construction and all the activity that comes with it start to recover through this year and into next year. But taken together, I mean, the interplay of these dynamics, we are looking at on the employment side anyway, in activity, there's going to be we're likely going to see a release of a large number of workers working in that high-rise apartment category through the next year or year and a half, which is likely going to continue to put an upward pressure on unemployment in construction overall through the next year for sure. And we're likely going to see, first we slow down in some of the site work, and we're already hearing about an increased supply of crane operators. And I think that's just going to start to catch up to the rest of the trades as 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 you go through kind of the building components. Okay, so back to tariffs and talking about the specific impact now tariffs on prices and construction prices particularly. So to kind of just where the starting point, at least how we approach and have been approaching this analysis as we can continue to develop modeling in this area, is we start with the looking at the products and materials used in construction. If we look at residential construction in Ontario, products and materials account for roughly 60% of the total building costs, and that the other 40% includes wages and salaries, but also taxes, margins, profits, all those other things. So any direct impact to prices or tariffs, especially counter tariffs, would be affecting the 60% portion of construction directly. And if we look then at the makeup of where those products and materials come from, residential construction is a largely domestic industry. So about 60% of those products and materials are coming from Ontario. The U.S. import share of all those is roughly in the area of 15%. Right. So if you include then all the total other costs of wages and salaries and taxes and margins and all that, you're looking at about an 8.4% intensity of exposure to U.S. Products as inputs into residential construction in the province. So if you did some basic math on top of that and said, okay, well, if it's 8.4% and you let's say you increase all prices by 25, to a little bit over 25% on that portion, you're really looking at a net impact of 2.5–3% on the price of overall price of construction. But unfortunately, with this stuff, it's not always, the math isn't always that simple. There's a lot of other supply, demand, and price demand dynamics at play. So certainly it's important to underline that the tariff impacts and counter to tariffs would impact various segments of the market differently, and very specific to types of products. So one thing that we look at when we're trying to assess which products have the biggest price risk exposure to tariffs, is we look at two things. We look at the import share of that product to the economy as a whole, so the import component versus what we make domestically, and then the U.S. share of that import product. If there's, if we have a significant reliance on imports for certain products, that's a challenge. But if there's a large opportunity for substitution from countries outside of the U.S., then it's not the impacts of that aren't going to be as severe. Versus if we have maybe a not as great an import share versus domestic, but it's highly concentrated from the U.S. So if you look at, for example, we talk a lot about steel, HVAC and stuff, which are important, but you paints, coatings, and adhesives, right? The import share is 24%, but 90% of that is coming from the U.S. And what's also important when we're looking at these elements, they're broad categories. So there's going to be some paint you can replace, but there's going to be other coatings and special adhesives you can't. And that means you're going to be taking the full brunt of those impacts in terms of our expected what we pay domestically. But certainly there's other things. The mechanical and electrical sector is particularly, I think, exposed to this. HVAC equipment has large volumes and also a large share coming from the US, but also electrical components, wiring, those types of plastics. We're talking about the elbows and things that are used in plumbing and mechanical. So there's certainly a lot of exposure to things that just aren't easily replaceable, from other countries outside of the US, which means that those products and those prices are likely to see the the fuller impact of any tariffs or retaliatory tariffs. So next, what does this mean? So for prices, and we've been doing some modeling on all this stuff. Again, it has been, I guess, I don't know if I'll call it enjoyable. It's been a challenge to wrestle with all these dimensions. But certainly there's going to be larger price increases on the products and groups of products where there's a high import share and a high proportion of US, the US has that larger import share. But prices are also impacted by other factors like the exchange rate, with the uncertainty that we're seeing. We've seen what's going on to the Canadian dollar. That means we're paying higher prices for not just things from the US, but also from the rest of the world, where our dollar has seen some net declines. And then that's where we're going to see some of these potential impacts here. See the 20 to 30% of change in import prices are going to take a larger effect. Where we are able to substitute for either domestic for domestic products, that'll be great. But we're also going to see some pressures on our domestic prices for goods. When we have certain US products that are inputs into some of the products that are produced domestically here, like some of the machinery and equipment, for example, that's going to increase the price of our domestic products as well. Also, we can certainly see some escalation on changes in our domestic prices as well. The big impact will be if there's a reciprocal tariff imposed on the US products on some of these goods where we don't have substitutions. But again, I think that our government has been quite good at looking at some of the same numbers we've been looking at and identifying responses that won't hit things directly. But there are other inflationary effects at play as well when we look at overall impact on prices. As suppliers and producers try to realign their supply chains to try to find those other opportunities, that's going to have an inflationary impact on transportation and other margin costs. We've also got there's opportunity and risk pricing occurring as well that contributes to potential increase. If you're trying to build, you're not sure what's going to happen with prices next month, or you're going to be building in buffers, right, for what you think those materials are going to cost, and what you charged in quotes. So that uncertainty is almost having a larger impact on the price impacts right now than any tariffs. You've also got I'm sure there's a bit of stockpiling occurring on certain goods. We anticipate steel and steel finished products are going to see some increases. So some of that stockpiling is going to just increase demand, and more market forces increase the prices of things in those categories. And certainly too, the final thing, there likely will be some opportunity pricing involved throughout the supply chain. If you've got, one box of nails that's suddenly 25% more, and that people are less likely to buy that, supply and demand dictates you're going to raise your box of nails by maybe, not 25, but 10 or 15%, to still, because of market forces. So at the end of the day, we can see prices on this chart here, increase in maybe that between that range across these groups. It's going to be much different when you get down to the individual product within these categories. One washer might go up and the other one might not because of the makeup, or down to that low. But certainly, at the end of the day, it's not just the level of tariffs and counter tariffs, it's the risk that's going to add to these price increases as well. So it's something to continue to monitor. I know something we'll be continuing to monitor as things continue to evolve on a daily basis. So I guess I'll just close with that. In terms of broad takeaways, the various, tariff environment that trade policy environment that we're in right now, could see a wide range of impacts on prices, ranging anywhere from 8 to 30%, depending on the specific products and what you're working with. Again, it's just, it seems like mechanical and electrical, are certainly most exposed, but some other things like paints, plastic products, and so forth. But a bigger risk, I think, to the industry right now remains the threat of tariffs and the policy uncertainty in terms of the economic outlook, and really keeping demand for homes, residential construction low despite the low interest rate environment. So I think long term this will all resolve itself, and we'll see that recovery. It's just a question of time and how long that we can expect this to play out. And I don't know about you guys, but I'm already tired. It's only a couple of months in. So I do hope that we have some of this, level of uncertainty low for all of our sakes and sanities anyway. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity. I know I probably covered a lot. I'm not sure if it was what covered what we talked about earlier, Andrew, and all, but again, things keep changing and everything seems relevant
no, I thought it was very good, and I kind of like how you ended it there. One of my favorite lines in labor relations is don't talk to me about Friday, it's only Tuesday. And that seems to apply to this. So we did have a couple questions come in, and so maybe I'll ask one or two. A couple focused on interest rates, and they didn't know if you had any predictions on where interest rates go. Some people seem to suggest that rates will fall and then could pick up, and then somebody else used the word stagflation when they asked a question. So
yeah, certainly interest rates, I think in this environment, there's certainly more of a higher anticipation that they're going to decline further, faster than they would have otherwise. Like I said, I think the concern the Bank of Canada has around inflation is low relative to the risk of recession. And I think even more all of the major bank forecasts I've been tracking over the last little while, all of their kind of predictions on the future directions of interest rates has been lower and faster. And for some of the reasons I mentioned around kind of the brake, the accelerator and brake impacts on inflation, even with tariffs being implemented, I think there's more risk on recession and the deflationary results of that. And I think the Bank of Canada is probably thinking along those same lines too, and they have probably more room to decrease over the next year or so.
we might end it there. I do want to say thank you because I know that you did update this presentation several times, and we really do appreciate the time and the effort. So thank you very much. And I'll turn it over to Meredith to introduce our next speakers.
Perfect. Thank you. So next we have a legal update and a Workshare best practices presentation from Mike Sherrard and Louisa Viknovich from Sherrard Coos. So they're leading lawyers in labor, employment, and health and safety, and we're very lucky to continue working with them. So I'll pass it over to them now.
Okay, great. Meredith, thank you very much for the introduction. So in the next short while, we're going to try to focus most of our attention on work sharing programs, try to talk to you about program eligibility and requirements. And remember, this from a policy perspective or from your own perspective, what we're really thinking about is there any way I can maintain the employment relationship with my people? Can I keep my talented group with me in these very difficult times? And that's what work sharing is all about. Most recently, our government has put in special measures to change the eligibility pieces that should be helpful, what that process looks like, and then a really short case studies. If we have time, we'll touch on mass termination, unfortunately, but mass termination are in the slides as well, because we do want to spend most of our time on Workshare. So I think with that, I want to turn it over to my colleague, Louisa, to kickstart us on work sharing.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mike. And it's so great to be back here with everyone, with you folks. Let me just get us set up. we go. Okay, perfect. Okay, so I guess we've heard a lot today, and just kind of reflecting on Adam's comments about the uncertainty and the uncertain times that we're in. Understandably, many employers and construction employers are looking at ways to try to get ahead of some of that uncertainty, including by making operational decisions. And as that relates to, things they can do at the local level to try to impact some of the changes that are looming. And so I suspect that that's naturally led to some discussions about, potentially downsizing operations in certain cases, considering terminations and layoffs as viable options. And there are some important considerations around that. And as Mike mentioned, mass terminations are included in the presentation, although that's not the focus today. But, there are some flags there that we'll raise for you. But, as Mike mentioned, our focus today is really on understanding the route for alternative measures, right? So keeping those talented workers that you have in place, the ones that you've spent time training and getting up to speed and investing valuable time in getting them oriented. So we're going to start kind of our discussion there in terms of what are those measures at keeping those employees employed. And we're going to talk about the work sharing program. So very excited that that's being raised. Interestingly, Canada's Minister of Labour has commented on the fact that this is actually not a very well-known program. And so we think it's unfortunate that's the case, given that it is a useful tool for employers to consider when used correctly. And so we're going to unpack that now. So the work sharing program is very much, as its name suggests, it is a tool that an employer can utilize when there's a shortage of work. So when there's an impact to an employer's business that's created a bit of a downturn, it essentially allows for the loss of that work to be spread amongst the existing workforce, rather than having to look at laying off or terminating any individual employee. So instead of a layoff, an employer and employees and a union, if one exists in that relationship, can come to an agreement, and they can essentially agree to two things. The first is a reduction in work of about 10 to 60%. And the second is that employees are going to share the remaining work that exists in the workplace equally. Now, you're going to notice some of our slides contain references in kind of starred sections or provisions. It's just a flag for you, and you would have heard Mike mention just a moment ago, there are special measures in place, and they've been in effect as of last Friday, and they are scheduled to be in effect until, I believe it's March 6th of next year. So we'll talk a little bit about what some of the changes are and how to the existing program. But for our purposes today, we still think it's beneficial to run you through how the program looks at its core, simply because those measures will only really come into effect if we're able to demonstrate essentially a connection between the tariffs and the downturn in business activity. It doesn't have to be an actual impact. It could be just a potential impact or a perception of the impact. But that's really when those special measures kick in. So let's just kind of take a look at the program as it stands, and we think there'll be some helpful content for you at the end to demonstrate for you the differences under the special measures. So as mentioned, there has to be a reduction in work in order for the agreement as part of the agreement. And one thing to flag here is that it can actually exceed 60% under the special measures. However, anytime we're looking at a reduction in work of 50% or more, we have to keep in mind how that's going to impact the regular earnings of workers within that agreement. And I flagged that just briefly to say there are provisions under the ESA that apply when an employee has a reduction in earnings of more than 50%, it can trigger a layoff. So again, the discussion is not so much about that, but just to flag that for you. So anything short of that 50%, just keep that in mind, how that impacts any kind of operational decisions going forward. Now, the other thing that's critical for employers to know is that there are two eligibility requirements for this program. Again, there has to be a temporary decrease in the normal level of business activity. And the decrease has to be beyond the control of the employer. So those are criteria that an employer has to satisfy in any event in order to be eligible for the program. Again, that looks a little different when we're talking about it in the context of special measures. The other thing to note here about the way that this agreement works, the agreement is applicable to groups of employees, and the technical term for what we refer to that as is a work sharing unit. So what that means is the application applies per group, per work sharing unit. And when we refer to that, we're talking about employees who have similar job descriptions and who perform similar work. That kind of underlies the rationale behind, everyone being able to share work equally. And so therefore they all have to be qualified to be doing the same kind of work. That doesn't mean that you as an employer couldn't apply, for instance, to more than one work sharing program. It simply means you have to consider one application per group of employees. And that's just a helpful flag there in case you're in a situation where, for example, the work being performed by one work sharing unit is going to naturally impact the work of another. And so that's kind of a consideration you might want to have in mind when thinking about the application process in advance. In terms of the duration of the agreement, it can apply as little as 6 to as much as 26 weeks, subject to an additional extension that can be applied for. The extension does have to be applied for in advance. It does not apply automatically. That's something that's worthwhile to note. And the other thing that's important to note as well is that there is a mandatory cool-off period under this program as well. And the cool-off has to be for the duration of the agreement itself. So let's say my agreement was in place for 26 weeks. I'd be looking at a cool-off period of 26 weeks following the agreement. Now, again, you'll see stars there indicating that under the special measures, that's actually been waived. But again, this is the program as it stands now, and on the assumption that you might not be in a situation where special measures might be applicable. So let's try to put some of this into perspective for you and hopefully give you a sense of how this all fits together. So take, for example, an employee, Bob, who works for ABC Construction Co. And Bob makes $25 an hour and works 5 days a week for 8 hours a day. Okay, so if we're looking at Bob's regular earnings for a typical week, we'd be looking at his hourly wages times 40 hours, and we'd be looking at regular pay of $1,000 for Bob's regular week. Now, let's say Bob's employer is currently looking at implementing a work sharing agreement for all of the workers in Bob's employment category, so everyone who's doing the same kind of work as Bob. And let's say, they've reached an agreement, whether with the union or on their own with the employees, that there is going to be a reduction in work and that the employees are going to share the available work remaining. And we're going to now have a 4-day work week instead of what was a 5-day work week. So when we do the math on that, we look at what the employer would be required to pay, which is Bob's wages for the 4 days of work, so $25 hourly by 32 hours. And in addition, Bob would be entitled to the amount that EI would cover. So what EI covers in this situation is 55% of the outstanding amount of that week. So if we're looking at the time lost here, we're looking at 1 day's worth of wages, which is about $200. So EI will cover 55% of that to a daily maximum. So in this particular case, Bob, under the work sharing agreement, would be entitled to the $800 worth of wages from the employer, plus the additional $110 from EI, for a total of $910 for the work week. So it is kind of seen as a win-win agreement in the sense that naturally, an employer can accommodate everyone by allowing everyone to continue working with what is, as I mentioned earlier, a kind of spread out loss, where that loss is absorbed and shared by all of the workers in Bob's unit, and there's an impact to all of them. The one thing that I think is also important to raise here, because I've made mention to this unfairly a couple of times, we've been operating on the assumption that all of Bob's coworkers, or that workers generally, would agree to participate in the work sharing program. And that may not necessarily always be the case. You may have some employees who elect not to participate or choose not to participate in the program, or you may have employees that are similarly not eligible for EI. So you may have folks who are potentially self-employed, casual employees, seasonal employees, summer students. You might be in a situation where you might have to dole out this work sharing program, knowing that there are individuals who might not be able to participate in it. In that case, we do flag there is that risk of employees being able to raise constructive dismissal claims, particularly when thinking through, the reduction in the impact to them. We say, look, it's a risk that exists. It's important to be aware of it, and important to have this strategic discussion up front about it and how to proceed if you are finding yourself in that situation. But typically, when these are rolled out, it's kind of there's more benefit to it than con, or there might be an assessment that the value of any kind of claim is outweighed by the overall benefit to the organization as a whole. And these are very nuanced discussions that need to be taken kind of with the facts in mind, but we raise that for you just to be aware of. Okay, so in terms of eligibility here, employers, again, under the normal terms of how this program works, the employer must be a year-round employer that's operating in Canada for at least 2 years. Again, we're going to look in a moment to see how that's changed under special measures. The employer must have experienced a decrease in overall work activities of at least 10% in the last 6 months. Again, that's changed recently. Be a private business, a publicly held company, or a certain type of non-for-profit. So yeah, also changes to that. And have recovery measures in place to return employees back to normal staffing levels and work hours by the end of the agreement. And I just want to pause there for a moment and focus on that last bullet there. Employers should be mindful that this is an application and it is going to be considered for acceptance or approval by Service Canada and by an officer. And when that application is submitted originally, there is a section or portion dealing with, anticipated returns of workers. The idea is, an officer in assessing the employer's application is going to be considering, is there a reasonable expectation of a return to work for the employees by the end or by the expiry of this agreement? So that is actually a critical piece in terms of the analysis that's being done. And so just kind of think through that as well on the front end in terms of what we might want to include to demonstrate that, and including, if there's uncertainty, how we might not have enough information to be able to make that assessment on the front end. An employer will not be eligible if the reduced business activity is due to a labor dispute, a cyclical shortage of work, or business decisions, right? So another thing that we just want to be mindful of, this is very much eligibility requirements, but there is also to flag kind of ongoing reporting requirements to Service Canada throughout the duration of the agreement, including, if we've represented to Service Canada that there's this shortage of work, there shouldn't be decisions made around hiring additional workers, right? That's something that's going to impact ongoing eligibility. Also, if there are other decisions being made, including individuals being added to or removed from that unit that I described a moment ago, those are also the kinds of things that are going to need to be reported to Service Canada on an ongoing basis, just to maintain that eligibility as well. So the special measures that we've kind of been flagging throughout for you, as I mentioned, they're in effect as of last Friday, so March 7th until March 6th of next year. And that is very much in response to the US tariffs that has been quite clearly stated and quoted from the minister publicly in multiple articles. And it's very much this understanding of kind of wanting to be proactive about this and encourage employers to look at maintaining the talent that's in their existing workforce. And so to be eligible for special measures, an employer needs to be experiencing a decline in business activity that's attributable to the threat or potential realization of US tariffs. I did make mention of this a moment ago. Again, there's no requirement for an employer to do specific evidence of impact. So you don't necessarily need to demonstrate that that's already happened. But you can demonstrate, why you suspect there will be an impact, or why there's a credible threat to the business activity and the decline of it. And so affected businesses may benefit from the special measures if they are new to the program, have an existing agreement, or are serving a cooling off period. So because there's been that waiver of the cooling off period that I just described earlier, the cooling off period that exists for the equivalent amount of time that the agreement has been in place, if you as an employer, for example, have already had an agreement in place and you're in that cool off period currently, you may benefit from this period of time right now in terms of being able to file an application and not have to wait any further. So here are the changes. Currently expanding employer eligibility. So you saw a moment ago, there was a requirement for the employer to be operating 2 years at minimum. Now it's at least 1 year. We are now including cyclical or seasonal employers as being eligible for the program as well, which will be applicable, I think, to some folks on the call, and eligible even if the decrease in work activity is less than 10% as well. So just kind of measuring those, a lot of those thresholds have changed. Similarly, allowing work sharing if there's been a reduction in over 60%. And similarly, there's an expanded duration. So now we're looking at a maximum of 76 weeks under the agreement. And again, as I mentioned, that waiving of the cooling off period. There's also expanded employee eligibility. So now seasonal and cyclical employees can actually participate in part of the program as compared to previously, and that helps, I think, quite a bit in terms of the analysis here when we're thinking about construction work and the nature of construction work. So just here quickly on the slide for you, I won't go through it just because we've already kind of taken you through this material. This is just a quick summary slide for you to review, and I think really does a good job of setting out the compare and contrast between the existing program requirements versus the special measures that are in place. It's unclear whether those special measures will extend. We've seen the government implement similar special measures in the past. For example, with COVID in between the year of 2022 and 2020, pardon me, and 2022. You might also recall some of the efforts that were put in place to ameliorate the wildfires that were going on in 2023. So the government does kind of review these things, and given how much uncertainty there is and what we've heard about today, it wouldn't surprise me if there was also some consideration of potentially even extending the special measures period. But this is, what we have in place so far, and as mentioned, hopefully a very useful tool for you to consider going forward. I'm going to pass it over to Mike now just to touch on some of the kind of key considerations around mass terminations in Ontario.
Great. Thanks, Louisa. Appreciate it. Maybe we go to the next slide. Just before we leave Workshare, a couple things to remember, just to emphasize Louisa's comment. Well, that range showed you 10 to 60%. We really believe you've got to watch when you're budgeting, if you're going to use one of these programs, think of under 50% from a reduction point of view, just from a risk mitigation piece, pretty important. And the other thing we're hearing as well is the application process to get to a Workshare program is approximately 10 business days. So just to keep that in mind if you're going to try to process one of these work sharing agreements. We're going to put up mass termination. We're going to literally just touch this slide. The Employment Standards Act provides minimum protections to employees. There are some exemptions for construction employees, and there are some definitions about who is considered under the Act to be a construction employee. So check that. But if you're in a workplace where it looks like you're going to terminate anywhere close to 50 employees in what we call a rolling 4-week period of time, then you want to get some advice. And really, we would say to you, don't wait till you get near 50. If you see what's coming is going to be terminations and you see that there may be, let's call it over 40 that may come in these next 4 weeks, we really say get to your human resource professional and or to a lawyer to talk through how these provisions work. Because what they do is the minimum floor, as we all know, for example, is if I work for somebody for more than 3 months and I'm let go, I know that under the Employment Standards Act, I'm entitled to 1 week at that point, and it climbs up to a max of 8 weeks. But if I'm that 1-year employee and I get caught up in what is a mass termination hitting this definition, I'm entitled to that greater notice under mass termination. And you'll notice, and just stick with 50 to 199, you'll see that it's 8 weeks. And there are procedural requirements to make sure that you've been able to give the 8 weeks. And if you don't follow those procedural requirements, you can end up in a spot where that 1-year employee is entitled to 8 weeks because we failed to go through the appropriate processes with the ministry. And so the next slides will give you that. I think we're going to pause there in the interest of time. Talks about establishments and so forth, but we really do want to leave a couple of minutes to take any questions around WorkShare, and we'll remain available too. If anybody has questions out of mass termination, we'll pick those up at another time. Feel free to call us anytime and we'll help you with the mass termination risks. And just if you're anywhere over 40, that's our advice is now start to worry about, will I hit that threshold? Because sometimes people leaving you and or how they leave and what the date of termination starts to get outside of your control. And that's why 40 is maybe a safe number to start to worry if you're seeing yourself or your workforce get to that amount. So I'll stop there with the really brief comments on mass termination. Turn back really to Louisa, and I'll try to help answer questions if there are any there as well.
So just before we do, I just wanted to touch on one thing, Mike, that you raised. So you'd mentioned, and I just want to kind of unpack this a bit more. The 10 days is roughly around the time that we think it's taking a Service Canada to review these applications. So just to be really clear, there is an expectation that you are applying no later than 10 days before the intended start of the agreement. So presumably, that would be why we would assume it's around 10 days for the for Service Canada to review the application. The other piece, just to add to that further, is when we're talking about implementing the agreement, that agreement, if you've received approval from Service Canada, has to be implemented within 60 days of approval. If it is not, you'd actually have the agreement expire or be withdrawn, and you would need to reapply. So just one other thing to flag in terms of timelines and to put on your radar.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah.
I think we'll move into the question and answers now. So we do have a few questions that just came in. So the first one is, can I implement a WorkShare program at my company, or does this have to be done through the collective agreement? And what about my non-union workers? So for example, their office workers.
So I'll take a stab at that one. So there needs to be an agreement reached between the employer and the employees with the involvement of the union. I don't know, obviously we would need to look at the collective agreement specifically just to see, double check, make sure there's no provisions that are dealing with these kinds of agreements. But on the assumption that there may not be, we would still need the union to be involved in those discussions. And as it relates to, again, the employees that are going to have this program apply to them, it is a group of employees that are doing the same kind of work and have the same kind of job positions. So if there's a coworker that's in a different department, query whether they can apply as well as part of a separate program, but that is kind of the gist of the way that would look.
Yeah, definitely separate programs.
Okay, thank you so much. So moving on to the next question. Can I force workers to participate in a WorkShare program, or is it voluntary? And what do I do if one or two workers disagree?
Yeah, so generally, if there's approval that's received on the work sharing program, it's applied unilaterally as across the group of employees. Naturally, there are going to be employees that could resist or not want to participate, or as I mentioned, may not simply be eligible to participate because they wouldn't be entitled to the EI portion of that program. And so you could be met with some resistance again, and that's why we kind of flagged earlier. You could be in that discussion about constructive dismissal risk, and how to have a broader discussion about what to do in the event that there is that resistance. But this is a bit nuanced, and we would have to look at, the specific circumstances around not wanting to participate, why, and if there are other measures that we can think about operationally to try to address some of those concerns.
Meredith, if you go back to that first question too, and you're engaged with the union, the tension will be lay off by seniority as opposed to shared. And that's the kind of debate we traditionally get into with the trade union in terms of trying to find compromise to get them to agree to one of these work sharing programs on behalf of those that they represent.
So I feel like that's a good segue into the next question, which is about layoff. So what if I start a work share program, but have to lay off workers due to lack of work? Is there an impact?
Yeah, so I think because of those ongoing eligibility requirements that we flagged, that would need to be declared to Service Canada if you do have individuals that are leaving the work sharing unit, including as a result of layoff. That would be a formal update. There are certain things in place, like for example, I know this is going a little outside the scope of the original question, but if there's a shutdown of the business, for example, you actually, as an employer, would need to apply 10 days in advance of the shutdown to Service Canada for kind of somewhat of an approval or an authorization to make those kinds of decisions in the midst of a work share program. So if that program is in place and you're deciding to make any kind of decisions operationally, whether it's to lay off an individual employee or perhaps more employees, the short answer is that there is an impact to potentially the ongoing existence of the program going forward for you.
So I think we'll just move on. I think we have one last question. So how have the rules changed? There was an announcement last week at the federal level. Does this apply to federal workers or all workers?
Yeah, so it would apply to any employer that is able to apply to the program, which is all employers. And so the special measures we've looked at, I don't know if am I still sharing? I believe I stopped
No.
sharing. Okay, I
You're
was
not
just gonna,
sharing right now.
I was gonna pull up the slide again, but we can certainly distribute that if it's helpful. That last slide that showed you the comparison. So essentially just a waiver of certain things that were more restrictive under the existing measures. Just to recap quickly, and a relaxation of some of those requirements, essentially being more flexible to allow employers additional time to be able to keep these measures in place under the work sharing program.
Yeah, we'll definitely distribute your presentation after so everybody can take another look at that. I just want to thank you both for being with us today. This is definitely a hot topic right now, and we thank you for being here. So I'll pass it over to Yasmin now to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Okay, with that, we have Crystal Smalden up next. She is the CEO and president of the Smalden Group. This company focuses on securing funding, navigating government processes, and overall they make big things happen in housing, mortgages, and development. Today she's going to be focusing on the impact of tariffs, as well as an update on grant funding and relief programs that may be available and the process to get started with those. With that, I will pass it over to Crystal. We really appreciate you being here today. I'm sure you must be so busy. So with that, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Yasmin. Am I okay to go ahead and share my presentation?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great. It's telling me I can't share. Is there a special way to do this? Let me see.
Maybe just try once more.
It says sharing is, oh wait, hold on. Can you see it okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay, I have no idea how to make it full screen because technology is not my thing, so hopefully it's clear. Friends, hello. Thank you so much for having me here. Like Yasmin said, my name is Crystal Smalden. I'm the president and CEO of the Smalden Group. So we will talk a little bit about what we do, who we are, and how we can help. I'm going to do a quick skip through my bio. You know, it's too long, it's too much, but I will tell you, as the CEO of the Smalden Group, it's a little busy around here right now because we actually manage grant funding as well as regular funding for businesses just like yours every single day. And we do that based on a long, many years of experience in doing this. Previously to being the CEO and president here at the Smaldon Group, I was working in government for more than a decade, and I was working in government in the funding files and a multitude of funding files. In those funding files, I was responsible for working with a variety of groups and organizations to find out what kind of funding they needed, how we could get it over the table of the Prime Minister and get it signed and sent back. I have been working at my firm here with about 200 of my colleagues from government for over 10 years now, where we've secured more than $5 billion in government funding for companies just like yours. See, it's way too long. Let's skip all that. So why should you outsource your grant writing services? I love that this goes right after my bio, because the reality is grants are one of those things where people think, one, they're not possible, or two, they're not attainable. And both of those things are wrong. So grants are attainable, but they have to be right for your company. And that's how we win. So let's talk about that a little bit. Many companies, especially in the industry in which you all are working, focus a lot on funding formulas, focus a lot on, municipal factions for funding, things like that. But there's a lot of federal, provincial, and foundational money that we get every single year for the industry. So the process is simple. No one in your office has to worry about it. It saves time and it increases your chance of winning the grant. So people always say to me, Crystal, how do you increase our chances of winning a grant? Well, there's two kinds of grants. There's a grant, which means it's money that's going to be given to you by any level of government or a foundation that you don't have to pay back. And then there's something called a contribution agreement, which isn't spoken about a lot. Those are actually very, very popular. And a contribution agreement is something where the government will give you a certain amount of money that you don't have to pay back, as long as you are contributing. There's also a secondary level to contribution agreements, and that's where they will actually loan you the money at 0% interest or award you the money that you will eventually, maybe, possibly have to pay back. We'll get into that later. We offer a unique research approach. We apply that to ensure that the best funding options are matched to the best programs, your geography, and the funding windows. I say that because we actually have a customized system that we utilize here. And this utilization allows us to take all of the information about your company and secure that into our system against every single funding available in the entire country every single day. So every 24 hours, we will receive information about what may or may not work for you. And we're able to communicate that over to you. We created this system about 10 years ago, and luckily the government provides all of their granting, contribution agreement, and funding formula and information online. So it speaks to the system and allows us to have all that information for you in one easy place. When you work with us, have key contact personnel information so that we're constantly working with you on building for the future. So everyone here has really large plans or is trying to stay afloat depending upon what's going on in the world. We also give insights into government priorities, which gives you a better chance at receiving funding. And an example of this, which may or may not affect you depending upon where you are in the industry, but about an hour ago, President Trump announced that effective tomorrow morning, he will levy a 50% tariff on all aluminum and steel coming from Canada. If that affects you, my office is a madhouse running around right now, trying to find a way to implement some of the programming that the Canadian government is emergency releasing in response to that this afternoon. So we are on top of things as they happen. So secondary to that, government priorities, we meet with the government once a month, each level of government, and we're given their priorities. So we're always looking at where are the people that we're working with or for, what do they need, and we're letting them know, and they're letting us know if something will be coming up in the future so we can best prepare you. And the customized grant proposals, we base them on the preferences of the identified grantors. So we're not just taking a grant off, say, the CMHC website and saying, okay, let's just write this, tell us all about you. We're speaking to them, we're working with them, and we're working with you at the same time. I've spent more than 7 years working alongside CMHC. And in many cases, I have been appointed to multiple panels there where I've been able to help in the decision making of the affordable housing as well as the new construction grants and the solutions lab as well. So I've worked on those and I am able to find out their preferences, work with them, and make sure that you are able to leverage my knowledge for your betterment. Here's some examples of some housing loans and grants. I don't want you to get too attached to these because they change every single day. But these are, as of this morning, because I wanted to double check, some of the things that we might be able to help you with. So there's currently an apartment construction loan program. It's a loan program, so that also falls under the levy of the second contribution agreement program. So it's a minimum of $1 million. It's a low cost insured loan. Most of you know about these things, but do you know how to get them and get them at the best possible rate? Affordable housing fund. So this one's all over the place, right? So they've got low interest, repayable loans, forgivable loans, or contributions. I'm always going after those forgivable loans. We want you to pay as little as possible and retain as much as possible so that you can best support your workforce and your bottom line. The Affordable Innovation Housing Fund. So this is a variety of amounts. If you haven't heard of this one, this is one of the ones that's quite interesting. They have flexible financing options. And again, they include repayable loans, forgivable loans, equity capital investments, and other arrangements. We've been quite successful with this one because it is so flexible, but it's very rarely talked about. So that's definitely something that we can chat about one-on-one. One of the things to know for sure is when we talk about innovation in housing, we're talking about things like green energy or, things that will be considered next wave or new structure. So we're always looking for new ways and new things to invest in from there. The Co-op Housing Development Fund, I'm not sure how many of you develop co-op housing, but there is a lot of money in co-op housing development, and it goes out the door every single day in a variety of amounts in repayable and my favorite, forgivable loans. So a forgivable loan is a loan that the government gives you, and as long as you meet the parameters of that loan, they forgive it and you get to retain that funding. For those of you working, in historical areas, the preservation funding is quite good. It is quite hefty and it is very available. So if you're working in the historical districts, we should talk about preservation funding. There's an additional contribution of $50,000 per community housing project, which sounds like no money whatsoever. But this is if you're trying to revamp a small community center, or you're trying to put in place some kind of helpful little community activity where you're building. We all know about seed funding, new construction. That's a little bit of money here and a little bit of money there, but it's money you don't have to repay, and it can often get you leveraged. So let's talk about the process of what we do here that hopefully can help you out a little bit. With so much uncertainty right now in both the economy, the workforce, and the world, frankly, there has to be a very targeted assessment of your business. That targeted assessment is step one for us. So we want to obtain information about your company. Your company is very, very important because that's what we're basing the grants off of. We have a form, and in that form, which I believe will be distributed to you after the session, you would complete the form to the best of your ability. And I know forms are annoying and they can often be aggravating, but we've tried to make this as easy on you as possible. What we're really looking for is for you to complete the form in bullet points. We're looking for you to put down projects you have upcoming, how much money you need, what you're going to spend it on. The reason is this is actually the form that updates to our proprietary system that we have with the grants. And when you complete it, it automatically starts running itself. So we will be able to run your business against every single funding program in the entire country that you may qualify for. And that's the part where it says step 2. Step 2 is that system. We typically run the system for about 7 days because we do not want to provide you a report that's not comprehensive. So it takes about 7 days of running it 24 hours a day, every day, to get you your first full report. It's going to tell you how it matches your business. The report's going to tell you, what the money is for. And if you have any categories of your company, so are you minority owned? Are you veteran owned? Are you woman owned? Those sorts of things will actually help the form. I always like to stop here for a second and say there's actually no fee for my service here. So we will intake your form, we will do the research for you with the system, and then manually, we do check it manually after to make sure the system is not playing games. And so there is no fee to have these steps completed. So here's an example of a sample form. This is a sample form for our friends at Moya Consulting. And so they are fantastic, and they send this out to all of their people, and then their people fill it out and send it back, and we do exactly like we do with y'all. So you'd fill out your business name, your contact name, all of the things we need to know, how many employees you have. It's fairly simple. We try and keep it as simple as possible for you. Here's some of the sample information that I like to explain to friends, is that it'll talk about assets and funding, any other funding sources you may have. Grant and project description is actually the most important part of this entire exercise. And here's why. That section that you do not even have to put sentences in. It's okay to just put bullet points or have your admin put bullet points. But that section is ultimately how we draw your business towards the grant or funding program that may apply to you. And if that is a fulsome section, it's actually going to allow us to pull an accurate display of your needs. So here we just put in a random like build sustainability. When we run something like build sustainability, it's going to kick back everything from trees to windows to roofing, to everything else you can imagine. But for you and for each of you working through this, the grant request and purpose is super important. Over the years that we've been doing this, we've raised over $5 billion and won that amount for our clients. In that process, I will tell you that every single time I trace it back and someone says, how do you have such a high success rate? Because the industry average for grant writers in Canada and all of North America, actually, their success rate is 43%. Our success rate here at the Smallman Group is 91%. So we do that because the grant and project description is absolutely key to knowing where the money is that fits you directly. So this is the section I always want to encourage people to focus the most of their time on. Again, there's additional information sections, any special organizations, things like that. If they apply to you, you can fill them in. If they don't apply to you, you can just actually leave them blank. The form will still submit. Okay. So the process continued. So what basically happens is you're going to fill out that form, you're going to send it in. We're going to run it here at the office for 7 days straight. So once that's completed, we're going to send you or your admin or whoever you tell us to send it to. You're gonna receive a report, and that report is going to be very wholesome for you. It's going to explain each grant and why we believe it fits you. It's going to explain to you what the grant's about. It's going to explain to you what the deadline is, how much it offers you, who's offering it, et cetera, et cetera. So very comprehensive. At that point, we want you or whoever's in charge of your funding to review the report. And you're going to come back and you're going to say something like, okay, Crystal, I think that we meet report numbers 1, 3, and 5, and we'd like to further explore these 3 funding pots. Okay, no problem. We're actually going to send you a government eligibility sheet. What breaks us apart from many of the other colleagues in my industry is this government eligibility sheet is something we sat down with the government in every single department with and worked through what they are looking for exactly and directly for each and every grant available in the country every time a grant comes out. So we want to make sure that we're checking off for you before we do an ounce of work, the exact same sheet that the government's going to check off when they're scoring your application. So we ensure that you meet that grant at a 95% or higher match rate. And here's why. Because if it's under 95%, it is very unlikely that you're going to win this funding. It's very unlikely. So we want to always be upfront and transparent with you. So this is part of the exercise we complete with you that is absolutely vital. We want to make sure that you're at that 95% or higher rate. This process continues to be at no cost to you. So everything up to this point remains absolutely no cost. And we will do this for free. Once we know how many grants, which grants, and the timeline of the grants, that's when our team would provide you a quote and contract about how much this may cost going forward if you would like us to go ahead and continue the process. And so that is done at the end of everything else. You have a couple options at that point. You can choose to say, okay, thanks, bye, we're going off on our own. And that's okay, because our whole purpose and our whole process is to make sure that you get the money that you need to function. Having strong companies in this industry is vital to our economy. So we want that to happen. The other option you have is say, okay, here's what we want to do, and we're going to retain you to go ahead and write these for us. And by the way, there's also another option where you can say, hey, maybe we're not going to go ahead with these right now, but can you keep running our report and let us know when new things come up? And we do that at no cost as well. So until we get to the point where we need to write you a grant and we need to work with the government to get it for you, we do everything else for free. So then of course we send you a contract invoice, blah, 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 and then we go ahead. One of the things I want to point out, the best part of all of this is when you win grants, I actually cost you $0 because the grants actually will reimburse the administrative fees that you pay me. So even though there will be administrative fees to write grants with our company, I write those in, my team as well, write those into the grant so that at the end of the day, you are fully reimbursed for my services, and hopefully you are better off than you were when we started. So that is my little short presentation to make sure that you have all the information about what we do and how we can help you. And I'm certainly open to any questions or comments regarding the presentation.
Perfect. Thank you, Crystal. We do have a couple questions that have just come in now.
Okay.
So we can start with the first one. So can the government audit my books if I receive a grant?
It depends on the grant. So it's really going to depend. If it's a contribution agreement, yes, they can, but they don't always. It really, really depends. So we stand by you through the whole process. We have accountants, we have lawyers, you may have your own lawyers, whatever it is, we have the entire team here to work through that with you, but it really depends. So if that's something that you're concerned about, you can actually say that to us at the beginning of the process. Hey, I only want grants that aren't going to audit my books. And we're going to mark that and make sure that we're looking at that for you.
Perfect. I feel like this is a good segue into the next question. So how much administrative work is typically tied to a grant?
So it depends on you. You can choose to have us do all the administrative work, or you can do all the administrative work, or we can tag team it together. It really, really depends on what's going to work best for you. And that's also going to depend on how much it's going to cost you. So I will say typically, to start any company at, start writing grants once we've gone through the whole process, Usually we need about 2 hours, not all at the same time, usually 1 hour one day and 1 hour another day, to get basic information from you to write the specific grants that you've chosen. Just enough information for us to write your narrative and get your paperwork that we need from you. Otherwise, it's emails here and there. We try and make the process as easy as possible with as little impact to your operation or your time as possible. So I like to say to people, I'm going to need 2 hours of your time after we get to the point where you say, okay, I want to write these grants. And that's usually what happens.
Okay, so not terrible.
No.
And when would be a good time to apply if I wanted to apply? Do I wait for the tariffs to kick in, or do I start applying now?
Big question. So the tariff remediation fund is open now. We've written about 300 of them in the last 2 weeks. So though, if you have a need to get tariff remediation, now is good, because once the money's gone, it's gone. So writing those as quick as possible is imperative. We do know that more programming is coming for tariff remediation and support. The second the government tells us that it's up and running, we will make sure we distribute it to all of our clients, and we will immediately begin to write. We have pulled in a multitude of tariff experts to work with us on these to make sure that the narrative is at top tier for you so that you don't miss out on any of these funds. When it comes to other grants, other funding, and other contribution agreements, it 100% depends on the deadline of that agreement. So typically when you're receiving a report, it might say it always comes in big red letters, your deadlines. So it may say due, March 31st, which means we need to roll, and we need to roll now. It also might say funding is only open until funding is exhausted. So that means I need to call the department immediately and say, how much money do you have left, and how fast do I need to get this to you? And there are other ones that are long-term. So if we're looking at capital grants, some of the CMHC capital grants, especially the new ones that'll come out in the spring cycle, those are longer term. So they'll open them in April, but the application won't be due till November. So there's also cycles. So it really, really depends. And I know that's not a fun answer, but when we're talking about grants, the answer is always it depends. Because some grants, they're 20-minute grants, and some grants are 250 pages of grant. So it really, really depends on where we end up applying.
Perfect. And I know you talked about Trump a little bit during your presentation. So is there a website where all this information is listed, or what's the best way to stay updated on eligibility, since he keeps changing the dates on all the tariffs and targets that are being set?
Yeah, so we've been updating our clients almost by the minute for the last 2+ months, every time something could possibly occur to them. Once someone submits an intake form with us, we automatically add you to the mailing lists that are best for you. And that includes the tariff list, updating you as things occur and as we're able to get funding into your pockets. So that is always my best advice, is get that intake form in. We're going to add you to those lists, and the information will start to flow to you immediately.
Okay, perfect. We have one more question. So will the grant be impacted by the federal election, or do we have to wait for the federal government to return before these programs get launched?
So that's a really good question. So the tariff remediation program is launched and running. So that is already full-blown running, and that will be allocated as we go. Grants run on cycles. So those cycles are often impacted by elections. However, when the previous prime minister stepped down, he did not stop the grant cycle. So it's actually still running right now. I don't expect to see Mr. Carney make any changes to the grant cycle. According to our contacts over there are no plans to change the grant cycle. So at this point, I don't expect to see any changes to the dates of deadlines or allocation of funds. When Parliament is closed, often it just takes a bit longer to get the signatures on the checks, but they're still moving currently. We will make sure that we keep everyone apprised of any changes that may occur as we move forward on that.
Thank you. And we've just got one last question that came in. Is There are grants available for restoring and relocating heritage houses.
Yes. So there are, I love saying this because people often don't believe me till I send them a report, but there's money for absolutely everything. So if you've paid attention to the US and you've heard some of the things that Doge is finding, we have similar things here. So in your industry specifically, there's money for employees, there's money for training, there's money for equipment, there's money for moving historical homes, there's money for building, there's money for housing, there's money for steel, there's money for wood, there's money for growth. Because it is a priority of both the federal, municipal, and provincial governments to build housing right now, the money is all over the place. And whether we have to piecemeal it to get to how much you need, or we're going to get it all in one shot, that will depend on a variety of factors, but it's there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Crystal. We really appreciate you being here with us and taking the time. I know you must be so busy right now, and I'm sure you'll be even busier after we send out your form to all of our attendees today. With that, I'm just going to pass it over to Andrew to do the closing remarks.
Perfect. And I just want to come on, give a couple closing remarks. So first off, thank you to all the speakers. So Adam, Mike, and Louisa and Crystal for their presentations. Again, those presentations will be made available to everyone who attended and everyone who registered, as well as the full recording. As we heard today, and as everybody knows, we do have a lot of uncertainty. This year, as everybody knows, is a bargaining year, and so that makes it tough. It's even harder to try and bargain new collective agreements with all of the trade, tariff, and we'll just call it the Trump uncertainty. For our members, we do this webinar and we send weekly updates because we want to keep you informed on the best information that we have. We're also advocating on behalf of the industry, and we're here when our members have specific questions, whether you want to call it a consultation or just to answer the questions that you have. We like to think that we've got the information, but if we don't, we can certainly get you in touch with somebody who does so that you have the information that you need for your business to make the very tough decisions that you're forced to make these days. Again, thanks everyone for participating. And if you do have any questions, please reach out to RESCON and we'll do what we can to get you answers. Thanks everyone. Bye.